This is the Native Vote, Native Voice podcast. I'm Sean Griswold. Today, we're going to find out why this voice from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe in Michigan matters to the 2024 presidential election.
The proportion of American Indians in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Carolina, Arizona is sufficiently large that it's multiples greater than the poll margins right now. So it would behoove either candidate to have a solid policy platform as it relates to American Indians.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump need Native American voters in order to win key swing states in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, and Nevada. Polls have these races in these states at a dead heat, nearly split between the candidates. It's so close that the small population of Native American voters in these states are a large voting bloc that will help determine who goes to the White House. We saw it in 2020 when Joe Biden won Arizona with significant turnout by Native Americans there. That's why in 2024 we're seeing massive ad buys from the Harris campaign targeting Native voters. And in part, it's why Forest County Potawatomi Chairman James Crawford took center stage on the second night of the Republican National Convention. In short, the road to be the next U.S. president goes through Indian country. In this podcast, we are talking with Native American voters in these states to understand the issues that will bring them to the polls, why they vote or don't, and what they hope to see if their votes can do to sway policy in a Harris or Trump administration. We're also going to understand how tribal governments are working in a nonpartisan way to ensure people are knowledgeable about the candidates and the voting process to make sure their ballots are cast and counted securely. We start with Dr. Aaron Payman, a citizen from the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, one of 12 federally recognized tribal nations in Michigan that could deliver the state's 15 electoral votes to the next president of the United States. Aaron is an elected official with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe and has worked with governments at the local, state, and federal level, on top of the policy work he does with tribal nations across this continent. Recently, he's had conversations with the White House and the Harris campaign about continuing investments for tribes on things like internet, healthcare, and education. He spoke with us last week after a recent visit with that campaign. Aaron is a quantitative social scientist. Numbers and people are his interest, which is how he noticed how vital Native American votes are in the U.S. electoral politics, and why he thinks the Native vote will determine who is going to be the next U.S. president.
I've been involved in tribal politics and civics and reminding the federal government to uphold the Treaty of Trust obligation. And for those who don't know what that is, tribes negotiated over 2 billion acres of ceded Indian lands in exchange for health, education, and social welfare into perpetuity. And so as long as others are on our land, we expect that the federal government will uphold the Treaty and Trust obligation. I was actively engaged to mobilize tribal people to vote all across the country. And in 2016, I recognized that the polls weren't looking too good for the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton, and I tried to impact the election during that cycle to get them to have a policy platform that related to tribes. There wasn't one. And as you know, Hillary lost, and she lost primarily in the Midwest. One of the things I tried to explain to them is the proportion of the total population that are American Indians is multiples greater than the margin of victory in the 2016 election. And then in 2020, 3 of us worked as a team in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to mobilize the Native vote. So the work that tribal leaders do is nonpartisan, but we focus on policy issues. And generally, one candidate more than the other has pushed tribal issues and supported tribal issues and had platforms. So in 2020, the Biden-Harris campaign put out the Biden-Harris plan for tribal nations. As we look at the election, it's tightening up right now, where we had a big boost when we switched candidates on the Democrat side from Biden-Harris. That margin has tightened up. And we're back to ground zero, and we're back to dead heat. And the proportion of American Indians in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Carolina, Arizona is sufficiently large that it's multiples greater than the poll margins right now. So it would behoove either candidate to have a solid policy platform as it relates to American Indians. Like in Michigan, we are almost 2% of the population. And right now, the poll margins are really tight. So we could be the margin of victory. Same is true in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And in Arizona. And Arizona is a big example because the American Indian population, so it would be Navajo, Hopi, and some Pueblo, they are 4% of the total population. And Biden beat Trump by 0.3%. And right now, Trump is ahead of Harris by, I think, just over 1%. And so there's 4% are American Indians. And so, it's a race to see who's going to get the native vote. Nobody should take the Native American vote for granted because we can be the determinant. We can be the margin of victory in this election.
And in your conversations with people explaining the significance for that margin of victory for either candidate, in talking to people on the ground and in Native communities, specifically in Michigan, how is that message related to voters? Are people understanding that, in fact, they can not only swing a state like Michigan, but the general election overall?
I think so. I think, 4 years ago, we were very successful in it. And we had a number of initiatives, like I did a direct mail to all 24,000 adult members of my tribe in Michigan. And again, it was a nonpartisan letter, but it hit on those policy initiatives. And then I encouraged people to go look at the platforms and make up your own mind. And I think by and large, my tribal citizens voted for one candidate over the other that benefited the victor. Like I said, I came from MAST, Midwest Alliance, and the Oneida Nation had a rally last night, and they had over 500 people. 500 American Indians came to the rally, very excited. And again, that was a nonpartisan, but they did hit on a number of policy initiatives. And tomorrow, Vice President Harris is going to be visiting that very reservation. And so it's my hope that the policy platform that we voted on today at Midwest Alliance of Sovereign Tribes, it's my hope that they share that policy platform with the campaign and see if we can get some pledges and some promises out of it. We know that when a candidate pledges and campaigns, there's not a guarantee that any of that's going to happen. But you got to ask yourself if a candidate does advocate and another candidate doesn't at all, that speaks volumes.
Yeah, and also you talked about the significance of a platform and just talking about the issues, understanding the issues that are important for Native people in this country. That is a start right there, but also visiting the locations where Native people live, meeting them in their communities, meeting their leadership. What's the significance going to be for Harris when she does make that visit?
Yeah, I think she has made inroads and made trips to Michigan in the last 6 weeks to 8 weeks. And tribal leaders have met with her at the general events. And so the way that works is the campaign will put out an announcement of a rally, and then they do special invites, and they usually have like a roundtable discussion with the candidate. And I know that she's had those with tribal leaders in Michigan for the last several weeks.
Okay.
And I think it goes over really well. It's very positive with tribal people. But what I'm looking for is something a little more concrete. And I believe the reason why there isn't a solid platform out yet is because we switched candidates. I do know that just before Biden stepped down from running, that tribal leaders were meeting with the campaign to help formulate what that platform would look like. And then she went into overdrive in trying to pick up votes. And so I think that it's something that just hasn't happened yet. Whoever can put out a platform, and I'll tell you one thing, it's not enough to rest on your laurels. So while campaigns have done and administrations have done wonderful things, we need to see what's coming, not what's in the rearview mirror. And so I think that the Harris campaign's done a really good job with meeting in tribal communities and doing drive-bys and drop-ins and meeting with key tribal leaders. We have to get individual Indian people motivated to vote. And how do you do that is you put things out like full funding for IHS, eliminating the means test for the ACA, Medicaid expansion. That way American Indians will get that health education and social welfare part of the treaty obligation no matter where they live, and they don't have to be low income to get it. So there's a whole number of issues, but the campaigns have to push those issues if they want to get individual voters.
Voting is already underway. Do Native people in Michigan vote early?
Yes, I voted. All of my family members have voted, probably because I cajoled them and twisted their arms until they did. So I would say yes. I think something really fundamental happened 4 years ago with mail-in ballots. So my tribe has had a mail-in ballot system since we've existed, so since 1972. So our elections are all mail-in ballots. And so we're already accustomed to voting that way. Some people, older people, are a little old-fashioned. They like the ritual of going and, talking to the voter volunteers. It's the same ladies that have been there since I've been involved, since I was old enough to vote. They're still there. And so I vote in person because although this year I knew I was going to be out of town, so I voted early and I voted through the mail.
We're now going to get into a conversation with Levi Rickert. He's the founder, publisher, and editor of Native News Online. He's Prairie Band of Potawatomi Nation and has been following not only tribal government, but its impact to the state, local, in Michigan, in the Greater Lakes region, but also nationally. He helps us give a large view about what the Harris and Trump campaign need to do to actively attract Native voters from his conversations on the ground, at campaign rallies, but also being in the rooms with tribal leaders who are looking to understand what they're going to do to have to work with either the Trump or Harris administration. We met in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention, and we were some of the only Native people there looking for other Native voices, trying to understand just sort of what the Native viewpoints were going to be considered in this campaign for president. And even being there was a lot of clawing on our part to just try to find people to just understand, in fact, Native issues are relevant, Native people are here, and then having conversations with people about what those issues are. We're, almost just over 2 weeks away from the election happening, and some of those issues are still present for us. And you've been all around the country as well, tracking both campaigns, seeing how the elections are going to be affecting Native voters, the targeted outreach for Native voters, from registration to getting people to do early voting. We've seen a lot, but now that we're at this point now, what is the most thing that stood out for you when it comes to how the Donald Trump campaign and the Kamala Harris campaign have been doing outreach for Native voters?
Well, in my understanding, there's been meetings that have taken place when the vice president flies into a location. She'll meet with tribal leaders, and I understand that there was a group of tribal leaders went down to Mar-a-Lago just last week, and he was 3 hours late for the meeting, and he came in and kind of rambled, from what I understand. But he did give them an audience, and so it looks like both sides are really soliciting the support of Native Americans. And but more importantly, I think tribal leaders are telling me they want to know what these campaigns, or if elected, what the administrations will do for Native Americans in Indian country. That is the key right now, is to find out what the campaigns are going to issue in terms of the plan to deal with Indian country in their administration, whoever gets elected.
From where you're from your home, from what's going on in Michigan, what you've seen, and then what are the issues that tribal people in Michigan want to hear and talk about?
Well, there are 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan, and the needs are very vast. And some of the conversations I'm having is economy, as with the general public, high concern to Native Americans in Michigan. However, also there are certain things that Native Americans are looking for in terms of how tribal sovereignty will be upheld in any future administration. So tribal sovereignty is a big thing in Indian country.
And I think that's why it's significant for us to understand what are the plans from each candidate. And we have some recent history when it comes from Harris, even Donald Trump, with how his prior administration worked with tribal nations. Is there any conversations you're having with people that kind of look at the what have you done for me lately, or what did you do for me in 2016?
In Michigan, we're kind of proud. The Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Brian Doolin, came out of Bay Mills Indian community up in Brimley, Michigan. And so if a Harris administration is in place in January, we're looking to see, will she elevate Brian Newland, even maybe be considered for Secretary of the Interior? So he's kind of our favorite son, if we can say it that way. He's done a great job as the Assistant Secretary, so maybe I'm putting a little plug in for Brian at this point. But he has, because of his being in high places, we've seen a lot of money coming into Michigan in terms of tribal support, financial, and Bay Mills is one of them. And he has helped bring some money back to them and for some environmental issues. And so it's a lot of times representation matters, and I know that's kind of a cliche these days, but representation really does matter. And Brian is our favorite son, so I'm gonna concentrate on him right now.
and that's an interesting tie that you and I have there with looking at the Interior, and the Secretary Deb Haaland is from Laguna Pueblo, where I'm from, and that's another prominent Native person people in the Southwest always point to as that's one of ours in the administration. Even if you're not Laguna, you take in the kinship to knowing that there's a Native person in those roles, and to know Brian is similar up there in Michigan. Speaks a lot to how the administration pays attention to what Native people are asking for. And then the other thing you hear about when it comes to Donald Trump is a lot of people are considering the litigious nature of what we saw during his first administration, where some tribal nations were in court with the Trump administration over various executive orders or even directives for his administration. So, that there could be people preparing for that if that's what comes out of this election. And it's fascinating too. I think I recall when we were in Milwaukee at the back to the Republican National Convention, and there was a conversation we had with Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who's running for re-election in Colorado, talking about even taking on the Interior. And we were live with Native America Calling at the time, and what that did is that once that kind of position got brought up, I just recall the Native listeners on the radio at the time called in, lit up the phone lines. And the election race became not the presidential race, which at the time was Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. It became Deb Haaland versus potentially Lauren Boebert for Interior. Like, people started looking at the impact of how the administration is more than just the executive. It's Department of Health. It's the things that run IHS. It's the environment stuff. It's stuff that helps with economic building, small businesses.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think what happens is there's a lot of concerns among Native Americans about the environment. And I think that is something that I know in Michigan, we're real concerned about the Enbridge Line 5. And that's one of the topics when you talk to tribal officials. What can happen in a new administration? What are they going to do about these Line 5s coming down from Canada into Michigan? Michigan doesn't benefit from any of the oil, but the Line 5 that is a old pipeline that they say if it bursts, it would be catastrophic to the Great Lakes for 5 to 10 years to actually remediate that. And so that's a high concern for tribes, and tribes have gone up on Labor Day weekend for many years now and have protested at the Straits of Mackinac. They want the administration, they work with the governor of the state of Michigan. What are you going to do about Line 5?
And Levi, I want to ask before we run out of time here, voting has started. There's votes being cast in a bunch of states, a lot of battleground states. I voted here in New Mexico. We're not a battleground state, but I got to go in person to an early voting site in Albuquerque where I live. I went on a weekday and at 11 o'clock before lunch, and there was a line of voters who were trying to cast their ballots. The poll worker at the polls told me I was the 800th person to vote that week. It was Tuesday afternoon, and at that polling site. So there's enthusiasm here with people voting. We're seeing some pretty strong turnout in other states. I'm done now. I'm happy to have my ballot cast.
Have you voted?
I'm happy to report I voted. I voted absentee ballot.
Okay.
And I know there's a lot of discussion, a lot of apprehension. Should you vote absentee ballot? And what I did, Sean, just to make sure my ballot was received, I went into the website, went to vote.org, in a matter of seconds, seriously, less than a minute, I'm thinking like 15 seconds, I was able to determine that my ballot was received by our city clerk's office and it was recorded as being received. It made me feel good. And so I like to tell our listeners who listen to Native News Online, you do not have to be afraid of voting absentee ballot. And, Sean, not so much in Michigan, but a lot of places in Indian country, transportation is a huge problem where people literally have to drive 40, 50, 60 miles to go vote one way. And then it becomes cumbersome because of lack of gas money, etc. And even time, and some of the roads are not always that good in Indian country. It could take up to 3 to 4 hours just to cast a vote. Hey, I did mine in a matter of minutes. Filled it out, took it to the post office, boom, it's done. I feel good about it.
It feels so nice to be done with that. We have 2 weeks. We have more than 2 weeks left for the election, and to have the voting part, the most central part of the responsibility done, gives us more time to be out there covering the campaigns and see what they're doing. Levi, we're going to talk more next week. I know you're in Wisconsin right now, back in Milwaukee, bringing it full circle. And so looking forward to looking forward to some of the reporting that you'll be doing out there, and we'll be reporting on that next week as we take a look, the lens from Michigan and how tribes are voting in this key battleground state into what it's going to be like in Wisconsin, another one of those important states and electoral votes for both presidential candidates, and how the future of the United States is going to look. And so you're in the heart of it. Hope you're having fun out there. Are you doing all right?
I'm doing fine, holding up well, thank God in heaven, and the Creator's watching over. So I think the key is we need the Native vote out, and our people need to vote very strongly this year. And it's exciting to watch the enthusiasm among Native Americans.
We're now going to take our conversation with Neely Bardwell. She's a descendant of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Ottawa Indian and is the editor for Native News Online's political section. Neely has been on the ground in Michigan and in the greater Midwest region, talking to Native voters, tribal leaders, as well as young voters who may be participating for the very first time, understanding what their issues are. One of the most recent articles Neely wrote last week had to do with a six-figure ad buy by the Harris campaign that is targeting Native American voters in some of these key swing states. Neely's going to give us a breakdown of what that means, while also discussing some of the more significant issues and impact that we've seen on outreach by both Harris and Donald Trump in this presidential election.
Bonjour, meine Domhuen Dishnakas, Lolan Donchava, Waganaxing Odawa Endao. My name is Neely. I am the political editor for Native News Online.
Neely, and you reported on something, a major ad buy that came from the Kamala Harris campaign recently that's targeting Native voters. Why don't you describe a little bit about what this is?
Yeah, so this is the most expensive Native-focused ad campaign, which has been dubbed the I Will Vote campaign, and that will air in Arizona, North Carolina, Montana, and Alaska. It's going to be digital, print, and radio ads.
Neely, talk a little bit about what some of the issues that do impact tribal nations in Michigan.
Yeah, so in Illuminatives and Native Organizers Alliance Indigenous Futures survey that they did, they were able to take specifically people who were identified to live in the Great Lakes region, and so they were able to give me that data. And one of the questions that were asked is their top issues in the 2024 election, and the one that received the most votes by far for the Great Lakes area was environmental protection and climate change. And so that is also the same thing that I am hearing in my reporting, in conversations with people from Michigan and in the Great Lakes area, is that environmental issues are one of the biggest issues for Native people in Michigan. So in Michigan, we have a pipeline that goes through the Straits of Mackinac, and that is Line 5. It has been operating illegally Governor Whitmer has put measures in place to to prevent them from operating. Unfortunately, as we know, Enbridge doesn't always follow that. And so Line 5 has been a very big issue for Michigan voters and non-Native and Native alike for a while. That pipeline is 70 years old, and it goes through a fifth of the world's fresh water, right? So the Great Lakes is a fifth of the world's fresh water. And so Line 5 is a huge threat to that access to fresh water. Tribes in the area use it for hunting, for fishing, for ricing. Ricing is really big in Michigan, northern Michigan. And so if that pipeline were to burst or break or leak in some way, that could be severely detrimental to all of the tribes in the Great Lakes area, Michigan, Wisconsin, alike, as well as other smaller watersheds and basins in the area. And so that is something that Native voters are carrying with them when they go to the polls or fill out an absentee ballot, is which candidate is going to support eventually the shutting down of Line 5.
Ultimately, no U.S. president has ever met its treaty obligations to Native Americans. And for people in Michigan, for really anybody across this country, they're going to have to work with this administration to get there. But it's been more consistent and more present with the Biden administration. Not only with Native people in cabinet positions, but there's a White House Tribal Summit. And even with what the Biden administration has done for Tribal Nation and its outreach over the past year, Deb Haaland visited Gun Lake. And that was all about infrastructure stuff the government has done. Do you have any memories or thoughts about that visit? Just, it's not a campaign stop. She's there in her official capacity as the Secretary of Interior, and it's done as a way to promote, this is what the Biden administration is doing. This is what I am doing at this cabinet post for Native country. How was that taken? Do you have any thoughts on that visit?
It is always exciting to have someone as high in a position like Deb Haaland to come and visit Indian country. It is always a welcome thing. And having Deb Haaland come visit Gun Lake was honestly really special, because Deb Haaland is Native just like us. And so when Deb Haaland visits, Secretary Haaland visits, there's immediately that sense of relationality, in the sense that she's just another community member, just like the rest of us. She's kind of like an auntie, but she works in the federal government, working on the things that need to be addressed for Indian country to thrive. And so having Deb Haaland come and visit is like when Deb Haaland visits Indian country, specifically like when she visited Gun Lake, is you're seeing the effects of having a president who respects Indian country in real time, right? Deb Haaland would not be Secretary of the Interior if President Biden, A, didn't get elected, and B, if he didn't have that basic level of understanding and respect for Indian country to where he, nominated Deb Haaland. And so having her come visit Indian country is like seeing those effects in real time.
Right now, that's the only campaign that has visible Native people front and center out there stumping for them. It's Harris. And Haaland is just one of many Native people that are out there doing it. And you saw some of this when you were covering the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Do you have any experiences you want to share about just being there as not just as a Native reporter in that space, but being there focused on covering Native voices, Native issues, Native delegates, Native electeds at the Democratic National Convention?
That was my first ever Democratic National Convention. You always hear things about it, but it's different being there. And so, as a Native person and as a Native reporter specifically as well, when I go to a lot of these spaces that aren't necessarily Native centered, you don't expect to see another Native person. You don't expect to be more than the only Native person there. And so going to the Democratic National Convention, it was actually really amazing to see. Like, I was at the actual convention center. I was walking around the concourse, and as I was walking, I saw multiple women in ribbon skirts. So it was really cool to see ribbon skirts at the Democratic National Convention, which is a place that you don't necessarily expect other Native people to be. And so I think that kind of demonstrated to me the sheer, not only the sheer resilience of our people to be able to exist in that kind of colonial space, but also it kind of shows the progress that American politics and the Democratic Party are making when it comes to including Native people in these important conversations.
This has been Native Vote, Native Voice Podcast. I want to thank Neely Bardwell, Levi Rickert, and Aaron Payment for joining us and sharing their thoughts. We'll be back with our next episode that's going to take a look at Wisconsin, and we hope to see you there. Thank you. The Native Vote, Native Voice podcast is produced by Native News Online with funding support from the MacArthur Foundation, the National Congress of American Indians, and 4 Directions.